The sun beat down merciless on the cracked earth of Arizona Territory, summer of 1873, where hope dried up faster than water in a busted canteen and second chances were scarcer than shade. In a place where the desert swallowed dreams whole and left nothing but bones bleaching white under an unforgiving sky. Sometimes salvation came wearing spurs and carrying secrets too heavy for one man to bear alone. Marcus Thorne had been riding fence for 3 days straight, checking the boundaries of the double-bar ranch where barbed wire stretched like scars across the endless brown. His horse, a reliable sorrel mare named Patience, picked her way carefully between the scattered rocks and thorny mesquite that dotted the landscape like warnings. The heat shimmered in waves that made distant mountains dance like mirages, and sweat darkened the back of his cotton shirt despite the early hour. He was thinking about water, about the cool well back at the ranch house, about anything except the telegram folded in his vest pocket that had arrived yesterday with news from back east. News he wasn't ready to face. News about debts and deadlines and decisions that would change everything he had built in this harsh, beautiful country that asked nothing of a man except honesty and the willingness to work until his hands bled. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the morning stillness, something that made Patience's ears flick forward and her stride falter. A cry, faint as wind through canyon walls, but unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. Marcus reined in his horse and sat perfectly still, listening. The desert held its breath. Even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed to pause, as if the land itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then it came again, stronger this time, carrying on the hot breeze that stirred the sagebrush and set the windmill blades creaking in the distance. Someone was in trouble. He touched his heels to Patience's flanks and turned toward the sound, following a dry wash that cut through the desert floor like an old wound. The cry came again, closer now, and with it, the desperate quality of someone who had been calling for help so long their voice was nearly gone. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach despite the blazing heat, that instinct that told him whatever he was about to find would change the careful rhythm of his solitary life. The wash curved around a stand of ancient cottonwoods, their leaves silver-green and whispering secrets to the wind. And there, in the shade cast by the largest tree, he saw her. She sat with her back against the rough bark, her legs stretched out before her in the dust. Her dress, once blue as a summer sky, was torn and stained with dirt and something darker. Her feet were bare, cut and bleeding from the sharp stones and thorns of the desert floor. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face that was young, but marked by exhaustion and pain that seemed older than her years. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold. They were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and fierce, holding a mixture of defiance and desperation that spoke of someone who had fought hard and wasn't finished fighting yet. When she saw him, she didn't call out or plead. She simply watched him with those incredible eyes, waiting to see if he was salvation or just another kind of trouble. Marcus dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. He had learned long ago that wounded things, whether human or animal, were unpredictable. His boots crunched softly on the dry earth as he approached, and he noticed how she tensed, ready to run despite her obvious injuries. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." She said nothing, but her eyes tracked his every movement. Up close, he could see the full extent of her condition. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, revealing angry red scratches that looked like claw marks. Her hands were scraped raw, and there was a bruise darkening along her left cheekbone. But more than the physical damage, there was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that spoke of trauma that went deeper than skin. "My name's Marcus Thorne," he continued, stopping a respectful distance away. "I've got water and food. Looks like you could use both." Still, she remained silent, but he saw her tongue dart out to wet, cracked lips, and he knew she was fighting between need and caution. The desert was no place for a woman alone, especially not in her condition. The fact that she was alive at all spoke to either incredible luck or incredible strength. Probably both. Marcus walked back to his horse and retrieved his canteen, moving deliberately so she could see everything he was doing. When he returned, he set it down in the dust between them and stepped back. "It's yours if you want it," he said simply. This time she moved, reaching for the canteen with hands that shook slightly. She unscrewed the cap and drank deeply, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as he watched the water disappear. When she finally lowered the canteen, some of the fierce tension had gone out of her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was like smoke, rough from thirst and crying out in the desert heat. It was the first words she had spoken, and they carried an accent he couldn't quite place, something that spoke of cities and refinement that seemed impossible in this wild place. "You're welcome," Marcus replied. "Mind telling me how you came to be sitting under this tree with no shoes and looking like you've been through a war?" A shadow crossed her face, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she lifted her chin with a pride that was both heartbreaking and admirable. "I was on the stage from Tucson," she said slowly. 3 days ago, maybe 4, I've lost track of time. We were attacked by bandits about 20 miles east of here. They took everything of value and left us for dead." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Stage robberies were becoming more common as word spread about silver strikes in the territory, drawing desperate men who saw easy money in preying on travelers. But most bandits were content to take what they could carry and disappear into the desert. Leaving passengers stranded without water or protection was as good as murder. "The driver?" he asked. "Dead. Shot in the first exchange." Her voice was steady, but he could see the cost of that steadiness in the way her hands gripped the canteen. "There was an older couple from Philadelphia, the Weatherbys. They didn't make it through the first night. The desert claimed lives with casual cruelty, but knowing that didn't make it easier to hear." Marcus found himself studying this woman who had somehow survived where others had perished, wondering what kind of steel ran through her spine beneath that torn blue dress. "And you've been walking ever since?" She nodded. "I knew the general direction of the nearest town, or thought I did. But everything looks the same out here, and I got turned around. I've been following this wash for 2 days, hoping it would lead to water or people or something other than more desert." Marcus looked at her feet, at the cuts and blisters that must have made every step agony. The fact that she had kept walking, kept fighting to survive when others had given up, told him more about her character than 100 conversations might have. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Again that hesitation, as if even her name was something precious that might be stolen if she wasn't careful. Finally, she met his eyes directly. "Catherine Marlowe." The name hit him like a physical blow, though he was careful not to let it show on his face. Catherine Marlowe. He knew that name, had seen it written in careful script on letters that arrived monthly at the territorial post office. Letters addressed to James Hartwell, the banker who owned the largest spread in the county and who had been bragging for months about his bride-to-be coming west to marry him. This was Hartwell's intended wife, the cultured Eastern woman who was supposed to bring respectability and refinement to his rough empire. The woman whose arrival had been the talk of every saloon and general store from here to the territorial capital. And she was sitting in the dust under a cottonwood tree, bleeding and alone, looking at Marcus with eyes that held no recognition of his name or connection to her intended future. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with her identity and everything to do with the way the morning light caught in her tangled hair and the stubborn set of her jaw, despite her desperate circumstances. This was trouble of a kind he had never faced, the kind that started with good intentions and ended with hearts broken like promises made in haste. But looking at her there, brave and vulnerable, and trusting him with her life, Marcus Thorne made a decision that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the careful boundaries he had built around his heart. "Well, Miss Catherine Marlowe," he said, extending his hand to help her to her feet. "Let's get you somewhere safe." She accepted his hand with a grip that was firmer than he expected, though he felt the tremor of exhaustion that ran through her fingers. When she stood, she wavered for just a moment, and Marcus found himself steadying her with a hand at her elbow. The contact sent something electric through him that had nothing to do with the dry desert air and everything to do with the woman who now stood close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that somehow still clung to her despite everything she had endured. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Catherine looked toward Patience, who stood waiting with the patience her name suggested, reins trailing in the dust. "I can try, though I should warn you. My experience with horses is limited to gentle rides through Central Park on Sunday afternoons." Despite everything, Marcus found himself almost smiling at the image of this woman, proper and refined, taking sedate rides through manicured parkland while ladies in carriages nodded their approval. It seemed like something from another world, another life entirely, compared to the harsh reality of where they stood now. "Patience is gentle enough," he said. "She's carried me through worse country than this without complaint." He helped Catherine to the horse, his hands careful and respectful as he boosted her up to sit side saddle. She winced as her torn feet left the ground, but she didn't cry out. Marcus gathered the reins and swung up behind her, acutely aware of how she tensed at his nearness before gradually relaxing against the solid warmth of his chest. "Where are we going?" she asked, as he guided Patience away from the cottonwoods and back toward the main trail. It was a question that carried more weight than she probably realized. The proper thing, the right thing, would be to take her straight to town, to the sheriff and the doctor, and eventually to James Hartwell, who would no doubt be beside himself with worry over his missing bride. That was what any decent man would do, what society and propriety demanded. But Marcus found himself taking the long way, following the meandering path of the dry wash instead of the direct route to town. He told himself it was because Catherine needed rest and care before facing the chaos that would surely erupt when news of her survival reached the right ears. He told himself it was simple Christian charity to see her properly tended before delivering her to her intended husband. He didn't examine too closely the way his heart had started beating differently the moment she said her name, or the protective instinct that had flared to life when he saw her sitting broken and bleeding in the desert dust. Some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, even to himself. "There's a line shack about 5 miles from here," he said instead. "It's got a well and basic supplies. You can rest there, get cleaned up and fed proper before we head into town." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus wondered if she could hear the thundering of his pulse or feel the tension that had suddenly filled the space between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful. "You're being very kind to a stranger. Any man worth the name would do the same." Would they? There was something in her tone that made Marcus look down at the top of her head, at the way her dark hair caught the sunlight like spun copper. "In my experience, Mr. Thorne, kindness often comes with expectations attached." The cynicism in her voice, the weary knowledge that spoke of hard lessons learned, made something angry and protective rise in Marcus's chest. What had happened to this woman, beyond the obvious trauma of the stage robbery, to put that particular edge in her words? "Not this time," he said quietly. "Sometimes kindness is just kindness, Miss Marlowe. Nothing more, nothing less." She was quiet again, but he felt some of the tension leave her body as she allowed herself to lean more fully against him. The trust implicit in that small gesture hit him harder than any declaration might have. Here was a woman who had every reason to be suspicious of men's motives, yet she was willing to put her faith in a stranger who had found her at her most vulnerable moment. The line shack appeared ahead of them like a mirage, a small wooden structure weathered gray by sun and wind, but still solid and secure. It sat beside a windmill that creaked steadily in the desert breeze, pumping water from deep underground into a stock tank that reflected the endless blue of the sky above. Marcus helped Catherine down from the horse, noting how she tried to hide her pain as her feet touched the ground. Without a word, he swept her up in his arms, carrying her the few yards to the shack's front door. She stiffened in surprise, then relaxed, one arm coming up to circle his neck in a gesture that felt both natural and intimate. "I can walk," she protested, but weakly. "I know you can," Marcus replied, pushing open the door with his shoulder. "But you don't have to." The interior of the shack was simple but clean, furnished with the basics needed for a cowhand working far from the main ranch. A narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a small table and chair, shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies. Most importantly, there was a wash basin and a mirror, luxuries that would allow Catherine to restore some semblance of order to her appearance. Marcus set her gently on the edge of the bed, acutely aware of how small and fragile she looked in the sparse surroundings. But there was nothing fragile about the way she met his eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her despite her obvious exhaustion. "I'll get you some water for washing," he said, suddenly awkward in the confined space. "And see what we can find for those feet." He retreated outside, grateful for the excuse to put some distance between them while he tried to make sense of the chaos in his thoughts. At the well, he worked the pump handle with more force than necessary, letting the cold water flow into a bucket while he stared out at the endless expanse of desert that stretched in all directions. James Hartwell. The name echoed in his mind like a death knell. Marcus had met the man several times, had even done business with his bank when he needed a loan to expand his own small spread. Hartwell was everything Marcus was not, wealthy and connected, with political ambitions that reached all the way to the territorial capital. He was the kind of man who ordered a bride from back east the way another man might order a new saddle from a catalog, confident that money and status would be enough to secure what he wanted. And what he wanted was Catherine Marlowe, the cultured Eastern lady who would polish his rough edges and give him the respectability he craved. Marcus had heard Hartwell talking about her at the bank, describing her accomplishments and breeding the way a horse trader might discuss a particularly fine mare he was planning to purchase. The thought of Catherine, brave and beautiful and wounded, being treated like a commodity to be acquired made Marcus's hands clench around the pump handle. But what right did he have to such feelings? He was nobody special, just a small rancher trying to make a living from unforgiving land. He had nothing to offer a woman like Catherine except the protection of his name and the promise of a hard life under an unforgiving sun. Still, as he carried the bucket of water back to the shack, Marcus couldn't shake the image of her eyes, storm gray and fierce, looking at him with something that might have been hope, or the way she had felt in his arms, like she belonged there, like she was something precious he had been entrusted to protect. Inside the shack, Catherine had managed to remove her torn stockings and was examining her injured feet with the practical assessment of someone who had learned to tend her own wounds. She looked up as Marcus entered, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than words. "Let me help with that," he said, setting down the bucket and kneeling beside the bed. Catherine hesitated, then extended one foot toward him. Marcus took it gently in his hands, surprised by how small and delicate it seemed despite the obvious strength she had shown. The cuts were worse than he had first thought, deep gashes from sharp stones mixed with blisters and raw patches where the desert sand had abraded her skin. "This is going to hurt," he warned, dampening a clean cloth in the water. "I know," she said simply. "Do what needs to be done." As Marcus began to clean her wounds, working with the careful precision of a man who had tended injured animals and knew the value of gentle hands, Catherine watched his face with an intensity that made him acutely aware of every breath, every small movement. There was something almost intimate about the act of caring for her injuries, a tenderness that went beyond simple medical necessity. "Why aren't you married, Mr. Thorne?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet concentration of the moment. Marcus's hands stilled for just an instant before resuming their careful work. It was a question he had been asked before, usually by well-meaning neighbors who thought a man his age should have settled down by now. But coming from Catherine, it felt different, more personal somehow. "Never found the right woman, I suppose," he said, not looking up from her foot. "Or maybe she never found me." "That's hard to believe." You seem like the kind of man women would find appealing. There was something in her tone that made Marcus glance up, catching her eyes for just a moment before looking away again. What about you, Miss Marlowe? What brings a lady from back east to Arizona territory? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications they both understood. Catherine was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. I'm to be married to a man named James Hartwell. He's a banker here, quite successful from what I understand. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, even though he had known this moment would come. Hearing her say Hartwell's name, acknowledging her engagement to another man, made the reality of the situation crash down on him like a load of rocks. Hartwell's a prominent man, he managed to say, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. You'll want for nothing as his wife. Want for nothing? Catherine repeated, and there was something hollow in the way she said it. Yes, I suppose that's true. He's been very generous in his correspondence, very detailed about the life he can provide. Marcus finished cleaning her feet and began to bandage them with strips of clean cloth, trying to ignore the way her words sat uneasily in the air between them. There was something she wasn't saying, some shadow behind her careful politeness that spoke of resignation rather than joy. You don't sound like a woman in love, he said quietly, surprising himself with his boldness. Catherine was still for a long moment, and when Marcus looked up, he saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression that she quickly tried to hide. Love is a luxury I can't afford, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Hartwell is offering security, respectability, a chance at a good life. After my father's death, those things became more important than romantic notions. The practical way she spoke about her future marriage, as if it were a business arrangement rather than a union of hearts, made Marcus want to gather her in his arms and tell her she deserved so much more than mere security. She deserved to be cherished, to be loved with the fierce devotion she had shown in simply surviving her ordeal in the desert. But he had no right to such thoughts, no claim on her heart or her future. She belonged to another man, or would soon enough, and Marcus was nothing more than the stranger who had found her when she needed help most. There, he said, finishing the last bandage and sitting back on his heels. That should hold until we can get you to the doctor in town. Thank you, Catherine said softly, for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. Marcus stood, suddenly needing distance from the gratitude in her eyes and the way it made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't afford to feel. Any man would have done the same. Would they? She asked again, echoing her earlier question. I think you underestimate your own goodness, Mr. Thorne. The way she said his name, soft and warm, with something that might have been affection, nearly undid him completely. Marcus turned away, busying himself with putting away the medical supplies while he fought to regain his composure. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of dust and sage and the promise of another blazing afternoon. Soon they would have to leave this small sanctuary, this brief moment out of time where Catherine Marlowe was just a woman in need of help and he was just a man trying to provide it. Soon she would be back in the world where she belonged to James Hartwell, where Marcus was nothing more than the cowboy who had brought her safely home. And he would have to find a way to live with the knowledge of what might have been, if circumstances had been different, if she had been free, and he had been brave enough to speak the truth that was burning in his heart. But for now, in the quiet intimacy of the line shack with the desert wind singing outside, Marcus allowed himself to memorize every detail of her face, every inflection of her voice, storing them away like treasures against the lonely years that stretched ahead. The afternoon light filtered through the single window of the line shack, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor as Catherine rested on the narrow bed. Marcus had stepped outside to tend to patients and give her the privacy she needed, but the walls were thin enough that she could hear him moving about, the soft sound of his boots on packed earth and the gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horse. She found herself listening for those sounds, taking comfort in the knowledge that he was near. It was a dangerous comfort, she knew. the kind that could lead a woman to forget her obligations and the practical realities that governed her life. But sitting there in the quiet sanctuary he had provided, Catherine allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to belong to a man who would carry her when her feet were too wounded to walk, who would tend her injuries with hands that were both strong and infinitely gentle. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful afternoon like glass breaking on stone. Catherine's head snapped up, her heart suddenly racing as she recognized the rhythm of multiple horses moving fast. Through the window, she could see a dust cloud rising in the distance, growing larger as the riders approached. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face grim and alert. He had his rifle in his hands, though he held it casually, not yet ready for trouble but prepared for it nonetheless. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "Could be nothing, but best to be careful." Catherine nodded, though every instinct told her this was not nothing. The timing was too convenient, the urgency of the approaching riders too pronounced. Someone was looking for her, and the peaceful interlude at the line shack was about to come to an abrupt end. The horses slowed as they neared the shack, and Catherine could hear voices, men calling to each other with the authority of those accustomed to being obeyed. Through the window, she caught glimpses of fine horses and better clothing than most working cowboys could afford. These were not drifters or casual travelers. "Thorne," a voice called out, loud and commanding. "Marcus Thorne, I know you're in there." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as she recognized the voice from her nightmares. James Hartwell had found her, just as she had always known he would. The man she was supposed to marry. The man whose letters had grown increasingly possessive and demanding as their wedding date approached, had come to claim what he considered his property. Marcus stepped outside, and Catherine could hear the tension in his voice as he replied, "Hartwell, what brings you out this way?" "Don't play games with me, Thorne. I know she's here. Where is Catherine?" There was a pause that seemed to stretch for eternity, and Catherine found herself holding her breath, waiting to see what Marcus would say. He could deny her presence, claim ignorance, but they both knew it would be a temporary solution at best. Hartwell was not a man who gave up easily, and he had the resources to make life difficult for anyone who stood in his way. "She's here," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but careful. "Found her in the desert 3 days ago, half dead from thirst and exposure. She's been recovering." "3 days?" Hartwell's voice cracked like a whip. "You've had my fiancée for 3 days and didn't think to send word? What kind of game are you playing, cowboy?" Catherine closed her eyes, hearing in that single word all the contempt and dismissal that men like Hartwell felt for men like Marcus. Cowboy. As if Marcus's honest work and decent character meant nothing compared to Hartwell's money and social position. "No game," Marcus replied, and Catherine could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. "The lady needed medical attention and rest. I provided both. Now she's well enough to travel, so I was planning to bring her to town today." "You were planning?" Hartwell's voice was heavy with sarcasm. "How considerate of you to make plans for my bride without consulting me. Catherine, come out here this instant." The command in his voice made Catherine's skin crawl, but she knew she had no choice. She was James Hartwell's intended wife, contracted and committed, and all the wishing in the world wouldn't change that fact. With careful movements that favored her bandaged feet, she stood and made her way to the door. The sight that greeted her when she stepped outside confirmed her worst fears. Hartwell sat astride a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 4 other riders who had the look of hired men rather than simple ranch hands. He was exactly as she remembered from their brief meeting in Philadelphia, tall and well-dressed with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having been denied anything he truly wanted. His eyes raked over her torn dress and tangled hair with an expression that mixed relief with displeasure, as if she were a valuable possession that had been damaged in transport. When his gaze lingered on the bruise along her cheekbone, his face darkened with an anger that seemed more about wounded pride than genuine concern for her welfare. "Catherine," he said, his voice softening slightly, "thank God you're alive. When the stage didn't arrive and we found the wreckage, I feared the worst. Mr. Hartwell, she replied, dropping a small curtsy that felt absurd given her current state. I'm grateful for your concern. Concern? Hartwell dismounted with fluid grace and strode toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. My dear girl, I've had half the territory searching for you. Do you have any idea what I've been through, not knowing if you were alive or dead? What he had been through. Not what she had endured. Not the terror and pain and desperate struggle for survival, but his own inconvenience and worry. Catherine felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a recognition of what her life would be like as James Hartwell's wife. I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused, she said carefully. Mr. Thorne found me in the desert and very kindly provided shelter and medical care. I owe him my life. Hartwell's gaze shifted to Marcus, who stood slightly behind Catherine with his rifle still held casually but ready. The two men studied each other with the wariness of natural enemies, and Catherine could feel the tension crackling between them like heat lightning before a storm. I'm sure Mr. Thorne was very kind, Hartwell said, his tone suggesting anything but gratitude, though I have to wonder why he felt it necessary to keep you isolated out here instead of bringing you directly to town where proper care could be provided. The lady needed rest, Marcus said evenly. Sometimes proper care means knowing when not to push too hard. The implied criticism in his words was not lost on Hartwell, whose face flushed with anger. Are you questioning my judgment, Cowboy? Suggesting I don't know how to care for my own fiancée? I'm not suggesting anything, Marcus replied. Just stating facts. Catherine watched the exchange with growing alarm, recognizing the dangerous undercurrents that could easily spill over into violence. Hartwell was not a man who tolerated defiance, and his hired men were shifting restlessly in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in town, she said quickly, stepping between the two men. I'm quite recovered now, and I'm sure there are arrangements to be made. Hartwell's expression softened as he looked at her, though his eyes remained hard when they flicked toward Marcus. Of course, my dear. You've been through a terrible ordeal, and the sooner we get you somewhere civilized, the better. Thompson, help Miss Marlowe to her horse. One of the hired men dismounted and approached Catherine with the mechanical efficiency of someone following orders. But before he could reach her, Marcus stepped forward, his movement fluid and deceptively casual. I'll help the lady, he said quietly. She's injured, and I know how to manage her wounds. The challenge in his tone was unmistakable, and Catherine saw Hartwell's jaw tighten with barely controlled rage. For a moment, she thought he might order his men to forcibly remove Marcus from the equation, but he seemed to remember that they were still on open range where violence could have consequences even for a man of his standing. How considerate, Hartwell said through gritted teeth, but I think my man can manage. I'm sure he can, Marcus replied, not moving. But, like I said, she's injured. Takes a gentle touch. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings that went far beyond the simple care of physical wounds. Catherine felt her cheeks burn as she realized what Marcus was really saying, the claim he was making without actually making it. Hartwell's face went white with fury, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. But before the situation could escalate further, Catherine stepped forward, placing herself directly between the two men. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. Thank you for everything you've done. I'll never forget your kindness. Marcus looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he couldn't say, everything that circumstances and society forbade him to express. For just a moment, the careful mask he wore slipped, and she glimpsed the man beneath. The one who had held her gently and tended her wounds and made her feel, for the first time in her life, what it might be like to be truly cherished. It was my honor, Miss Marlowe, he said quietly. I hope you find happiness. The formal words were like knives in her chest, each one precisely chosen to maintain the proper distance between them while hiding the truth that blazed in his eyes. Catherine felt tears threatening and blinked them back, knowing that any display of emotion would only make things worse for both of them. "I'm ready to go," she said, turning toward Hartwell's man who waited with his horse. But as Thompson moved to help her mount, Catherine's injured feet betrayed her. The combination of exhaustion, emotion, and the painful wounds that were still healing sent her stumbling, and she would have fallen if Marcus hadn't moved with lightning speed to catch her. For just a moment, she was in his arms again, feeling the solid strength of his chest against her cheek, and breathing in the scent of leather and sage that she would forever associate with safety. His hold tightened for just an instant, as if he couldn't bear to let her go, and she felt him press his face briefly against her hair. "I never meant to love you," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "But I do." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart race with a mixture of joy and despair. This was what she had been afraid to hope for, the confirmation that the connection she felt was not one-sided, that in the space of a few hours, something profound and lasting had grown between them. But it was also the cruelest gift he could have given her, the knowledge of what she was losing just as she was forced to walk away from it forever. "Catherine!" Hartwell's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Marcus steadied her carefully, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. When Catherine looked up at him, his face was once again the careful mask of polite concern, giving no hint of the words he had just spoken or the revolution they had caused in her heart. "Just tired," she managed to say, though her voice shook slightly. "The heat, I think." Hartwell was beside her in an instant, his hands possessive as they gripped her shoulders. "You should have said something sooner. Thompson, get her some water. We need to get her out of this sun." As the hired man hurried to comply, Hartwell turned his attention back to Marcus, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "I think we've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Thorne. Catherine needs proper medical attention, not amateur field dressing." The insult was deliberate and cutting, designed to put Marcus in his place and remind everyone present of the social distance between a successful banker and a working cowboy. Catherine saw Marcus's jaw tighten, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Course," he said evenly. "Just want to make sure she gets where she's going safe." "She'll be perfectly safe with me," Hartwell said, his tone brooking no argument. "After all, she's going to be my wife." The possessive way he said it, as if Catherine were already his property rather than a woman with her own thoughts and feelings, made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to smile and nod, playing the role of the grateful fiancée even as her heart broke with each passing moment. Thompson returned with water, and Catherine drank gratefully, using the time to compose herself and push down the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. When she was finished, Hartwell took her arm with the kind of firm grip that suggested ownership rather than support. "Come along, my dear," he said. "It's time to go home." Home. The word echoed in Catherine's mind as Hartwell helped her onto the spare horse they had brought. Where was home for her now? Not the comfortable house in Philadelphia where she had grown up, not James Hartwell's grand mansion where she would soon be mistress, and certainly not this remote line shack where she had spent the most meaningful hours of her life. As the party prepared to leave, Catherine found herself looking back at Marcus one last time. He stood in the doorway of the shack, his rifle still in his hands, watching them with an expression she couldn't read. The afternoon sun slanted across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the first moment she saw him. "I never meant to love you, but I do." The words echoed in her mind, a bittersweet gift that would have to sustain her through all the lonely years ahead. At least she would know, for the rest of her life, what it felt like to be loved completely and without reservation, even if only for a few precious hours. Hartwell mounted his black stallion and moved to ride beside her, his presence both protective and confining. As they began to move away from the line shack, Catherine heard him talking, making plans for their wedding and their future together. but the words seemed to come from very far away. All her attention was focused on the man growing smaller in the distance behind them, the cowboy who had saved her life and then broken her heart with 5 simple words that changed everything and nothing at all. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. But all Catherine could think about was the look in Marcus Thorne's eyes when he told her he loved her, and the terrible knowledge that she would carry that moment with her forever, a secret treasure hidden in the deepest part of her heart, where James Hartwell could never find it.